Someone else's sermon is here, but I think I'll probably preach the one I brought. You know, I made a big mistake last night. I was with some friends from seminary days, and I knew that Steve Montgomery had been here yesterday for the series at noon, and so I said, well, what did the preacher say, hoping that, we wouldn't have the same text or something. And he said, well, he started with a flute solo, and then he preached a rousing Baptist sermon, and then he ended by playing the saxophone down the aisle. And I thought to myself, sometimes it's better not to ask. But some people only remember me as the preacher who dropped a big stone on the floor here at Calvary Church. And I think it's been repaired. But it's wonderful to be back with you. So good to be here, and I know you've mainly come for the waffles, but we'll have a word before the waffles. This gospel that Eileen just read would get a failing grade in an English class. Jesus starts out saying he's talking about prayer. That's the thesis sentence. Then he has a whole section about justice. Then he ends by talking about faith. And the English teacher says, you need to go back and rewrite that paragraph. So what's going on here? This must be a text about prayer, because that's what Jesus says at the beginning. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not lose heart. This is a text about prayer, about being so persistent in praying as this widow is in crying out for justice. This is a text about prayer. Not so fast. Somebody else says most of the text is about justice. This is a text about justice. It's very clear. The widow says it plainly, grant me justice against my opponent. Now, Jesus might have chosen some other character to talk about persistence. But he chose a poor widow. And I have this sense that Jesus knew a lot of poor widows. He didn't want us to see this widow as just a cardboard prop. She was a real person. If her husband had owned any land, it was unlikely that she could have ever inherited that land. If she managed to inherit the land, it would have probably been hard for her to work the land and get enough produce to keep the farm going. So she would have to borrow money, and then she would put the land up as collateral. And when she couldn't make it, the bank would take the land and probably her home. Now, we don't know if that's exactly what happened to this widow, but some injustice had been done to her, and she would not stand for it. Really, she shouldn't even be here in court, because women weren't really allowed to testify in court, but she evidently had no male relative who was willing to stand up for her. So she is all alone. She is going to pester this judge until he gives her justice. And isn't he a character? This is what he says. Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, this is a very honest judge. Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. Now that translation, so she will not wear me out, is really weak. The Greek verb really says, so she will not give me a black eye. So she will not make me look foolish. So she will not expose me to other people, and they will all know that I do not follow the law. And so finally he grants her justice against her opponent. 7 verses, Jesus says justice 4 times. This is a parable about justice. No. Another person weighs in. This is a parable about faith. Really, this is where Jesus ends. This is what he says. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? It's as though Jesus is saying, well, you've heard all of this now, but what I really, and you think you've gotten the point, but what I really want to say to you is, will you keep the faith? Will you keep the faith? Will you be faithful? This Gospel of Luke was written years after Jesus had left the earth and left the disciples, and now the question really is, will you have faith? Will you keep the faith? This is a text about faith. It's clear. That's the summary sentence. So what do you think? Is this about prayer, or about justice, or about faith? Yes. Well, by now you could probably tell that Jesus wants us to hold all of these together: prayer and justice and faith. The thing is, and I've heard this story many times, and congregations will say, now don't send us a preacher who talks about politics. Did you ever hear that? You know, it's really okay to talk about prayer. That's a holy topic. It's okay to talk about faith. That belongs in church. But justice? I don't know. You can't talk about justice very long before it gets to sound political. And pretty soon people will want that widow to be wearing that t-shirt that you can buy now that says, nevertheless, she persisted. Now, Jesus wants us to hold all 3 of these together. If we pray and never work for justice, our prayers are empty. If we work for justice and never pray, then I'm likely to think everything is up to me. And if we pray and work for justice but don't have faith in God, we'll give up when justice doesn't come. We'll give up. Justice is holy work. It is as holy as prayer and faith. I think one of the most persistent pesterers of our time is Marian Wright Edelman, founder of the Children's Defense Fund, now its president. Have you ever heard her speak? She talks so fast, she talks like an auctioneer, and you can't even get the words in. And one time I asked her, Marian, why do you talk so fast? She said, I talk fast because children's lives depend on it. She's been adamant about gun control, trying to get some kind of gun control through the Congress. And not long ago, she said this: I woke up the morning after the Senate votes thinking about Sojourner Truth, one of my role models, a brilliant and indomitable slave woman who could neither read nor write, but who was passionate about ending unjust slavery and second-class treatment of women. At the end of one of her anti-slavery talks in Ohio, a man came up to her and said, Old woman, do you think your talk about slavery does any good? Do you suppose people care what you say? Why, I don't care any more for your talk than I do for the bite of a flea. Perhaps not, she said, but Lord willing, I'll keep you scratching. Oh, she loved that story. And she went on with her own words. She said, enough fleas biting strategically can make even the biggest dog uncomfortable. And if they flick us off, some more of us will keep coming. We'll keep coming back with our calls and our emails, our visits and nonviolent protests and our votes, and we will win. She said, we will win. She has no evidence that we will win. But she keeps pestering and working because she believes that this isn't only a political agenda, this is holy work, prayer and justice and faith, all tied up together. What a time we're in. There's never been a time when pestering is so needed. Will the poor widow have Medicare? Will the children have health insurance? Will illegal immigrants ever find a road to citizenship? Will parents continue to be arrested outside of nursery schools? We're probably in many different places politically, but if we are people who follow the way of Jesus, we will try with all our might to keep prayer and justice and faith together and not tear them apart. We're called to be those fleas now. We're going to keep somebody scratching. We're going to keep pestering until justice comes.